All right, welcome everybody to the Society of Gender Professionals Gender Cafe and CSW 66 parallel event on centering Indigi-Feminist voices on climate justice. And thank you everybody for joining. We're just going to take a brief run through the agenda and introduce SGP first. So next slide, please. So I'm Saira Zuberi. I was formerly on the SGP Secretariat. I've just stepped down and I lead communications for SGP. And I'm just going to kick off the event with a little bit of an overview of SGP and then introduce the moderator who will introduce the topic and the panel. We'll have the moderated discussions with a panel of great speakers for about 40 minutes and then breakout rooms for 20 to 30 minutes each. We'll see how we're doing for time. We have a 2-hour time slot. So we'll have one breakout room session and then another so that everybody can attend 2 different breakout rooms and the speakers will stay in one room. After that, we'll come back into the main room, have a brief sharing of highlights and then a wrap up. In terms of the recording of the session, we do record the main session, but the breakout rooms are not recorded. So any notes or highlights that are shared from that are completely anonymized notes, just so that everybody's aware. And at the end, we'll also tell you how you can keep in touch with SGP in future for those especially who are not familiar with us. Next slide, please. So on the screen, you have SGP's mission, which I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can learn more about SGP specifically from visiting the website, genderprofessionals.org. But just quickly and briefly, SGP is an international association of gender practitioners, academics, and activists who are dedicated to promoting feminist action and applied research and raising the profile of gender expertise around the world. And of course, we hope you'll go to the website and learn more, but essentially, SGP seeks to support member collaboration, network building, mentoring, and leadership, co-leadership, shared leadership to advance feminist movement building and gender justice. Next slide. And here, just briefly about the history and where we're at now. SGP was founded in 2017 or 2018 with a group of feminists coming together to address a gap. There was a sense that there's a perceived gap in support for those who focus on gender rights and equity in their work or in their advocacy or activism or research. Outside of formal gender studies departments and universities, there aren't so many spaces for us to connect and support mutual learning and engagement as individuals. Since SGP's formal membership structure was launched in 2019, close to, actually, this is figures from late last year, so close to 500 people have registered as dues paying members since that time. And our online communications reach thousands of subscribers and followers across all continents. Next slide, please. So SGP's gender cafes speak to one of SGP's goals, which is to foster the production and dissemination of applied gender research and knowledge that promotes gender justice and strengthens the work of those who are committed to advancing gender justice. One way we do that is by collaborating with partners, feminists and practitioners and organizations to host gender cafes. These don't have a fixed schedule, but we've had 2 so far in 2022, and we are happy to receive proposals if you have an idea you'd like to collaborate with SGP on. You can visit the website to access resources from past gender cafes and access the gender cafe proposal form from genderprofessionals.org and the gender cafes section of the website. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to introduce you to the moderator for today, who is Ali Constantine. Ali is SGP's climate justice intern and a climate justice researcher and activist who has been working to advance climate justice both in her home country of Canada and abroad. She's a recent graduate of the Masters in Gender Studies program at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, where she's studied the intersection of culture and society as it relates to climate, colonialism, and capitalism. So over to you, Ali, and next slide.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see everybody here today. On today's session, we're talking about centering Indigenous feminist voices on climate change. So next slide, please. So the idea for today's panel session was to learn from experiences shared by Indigenous feminists who identify as such and amplify the important work they are doing. Broadly, but definitely not exclusively, Indigenous feminisms interweave Indigenous experience, knowledge, and worldviews through an intersectional lens. Indigenous feminism often includes connection to land, Indigenous sovereignty, decolonization, and climate justice. In this session, we're not going to put forth any simple definition of indigeneity, as we understand that the concept is complex. However, we know that according to common classifications, some less than 5% of the world's population is considered indigenous, and they are at the front lines of protecting 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. So while we're in an increasing time of visible ecological disaster, the majority of biodiversity globally is stewarded by Indigenous peoples around the world. And yet, Indigenous people still have always been on the first to feel the effects of climate change through ongoing colonization, resource extraction, land grabbing, and violence against women and gender diverse people, which are all interrelated to Indigenous exploitation. Indigenous feminism examines a link between all forms of oppression, often as they were related to gendered violence against the earth and gendered violence against Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited people, and gender diverse people. So ultimately, the goal for today is to ensure we continue to not only keep and sustain a network of feminists fighting for climate change, but also to continue to grow and foster important connections between climate justice advocates and feminists globally, and importantly, keep Indigenous knowledge by Indigenous people at the forefront continuously. We've seen a lot of greenwashing and appropriation of Indigenous knowledges and worldviews around climate change and by large companies and organizations, which is increasing. And so we want to make sure that people know Indigenous feminisms are neither new nor fleeting or a trend. This session also seeks to open spaces up for us to both amplify the efforts, voices, and analyses of Indigenous feminists, and also to imagine intersectional feminist ecological approaches which posit climate change and gender justice as core elements for ensuring Earth rights, human rights, and a sustainable world for future generations to come. Through organizing this, we've run into a few barriers, including language barriers. Those who are on the front lines of climate justice are often not able to join discussions like this for many reasons, especially if the program is only in English. And so we are therefore so thankful and grateful to those who are able to join us today on the panel, as well as those who are able to join in and listen and participate with us. The theme of today's Gender Cafe is a response in part to the calls from Indigenous rights advocates and majority world feminists for greater inclusion in key multilateral spaces like the Commission on the Status for Women or the COP, a Conference of Parties, climate conferences, especially given the worsening of barriers due to COVID restrictions, vaccine apartheid, passport privilege, and a host of other deepening forms of inequality. So that said, today we are really excited to have panelists Dr. Losang Ragbi from Tibet, Anita Soina from Kenya, Fuluke Adamokon from Nigeria, and Lisa Perch from Barbados joining us today. You'll hear more from our inspiring speakers soon, but to start us off, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Losang Ragbi from Tibet. Next slide, please. All right, so Dr. Losang Ragbi, born in India and raised in Canada, first returned to Tibet with her family in 1987. She co-founded Machik, a community organization that began with establishing schools in rural Tibet and which has grown over the past 20 years, expanding to green energy, clean drinking water, healthcare and infrastructure, and building initiatives to strengthen local communities. Her current research interests include gender relations and social entrepreneurship in Tibet. Without further ado, over to you, Losang. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much. Really such a gratitude to everyone who has put in so much time and effort to create this platform. I'm really honored to be here and excited to learn from everyone else. I will begin by sharing. I'm not able to share the screen.
Okay, go ahead and try again, Losang. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. It's working now. Great. Thank you so much. Wonderful. So yes, Machik is a nonprofit organization. It is the team at the office is led by majority Tibetan women. And our goal, our mission is to grow a global community committed to a stronger future for Tibet. And the first, environmental kind of teachers I ever had were my parents, because they hold very, very traditional Tibetan values close to their hearts. And my sister and I are extremely lucky that my parents prioritized taking us to Tibet in 1987. It was a life-changing event for us. Having grown up in a small town in Northern Ontario, it was, we speak the Tibetan language, of course, that is my mother tongue, but it was really amazing to actually go to Tibet and meet our family for the first time. I was 18. The highlight clearly was meeting my grandmother, my father's mother. And I remember we were high up in the forest, I think 14,000 feet up in the mountains of Tibet, high altitude alpine forest. And my grandmother pointed to, one of hundreds of beautiful coniferous trees. And she told me, before you cut a tree, it is imperative to apologize to the spirit of the tree and to make a promise to use it for good purposes and as best you can. And so there was this understanding of natural resource use as being people on this shared planet, but she was teaching me a very important ethic, and that it really shook me, like nothing I've read or seen since. It really, really shook me. I think it was at the right time in my life. I needed to hear it. And this has informed so much of what we're trying to do as Machika, this nonprofit working on Tibetan issues. I'm sharing an image here of my parents, because fast forward from 1987, in 1998, my parents decided to really invest what they could in building the first real school in the village where my father was born and raised, where I had met my grandmother. And the way they did it, because they are now retired factory workers, they decided to invest my father's retirement savings and put it into building the first primary school there. And this is what they were able to build. This is what was there before, a school with about 20, 25 students at any given time. And this is what over the last many years, we have slowly, bit by bit, been able to build. And so we went from 25 students to 850. We required 50% girls. And we had to follow the local curriculum, but we were very fortunate to be able to add courses and add classes and special summer programs, et cetera. And that's where we were able to, re-engage students with, of course, their parents know the land intimately and the students learn, but we were worried that while students are in the classes, 10 months a year, 5 days a week, we wanted them to maintain the link to their environmental ethic that is so traditional. So that was one of the ways in which we made sure that there was gender representation, as well as a link back to our traditional cultural conservation values as these children continued in school. And as a nonprofit, we have been committed to working far outside of one little village, and have now supported education for thousands of women and girls in other parts of Tibet, created a summer enrichment program which prioritized conservation training for young people, introducing amazing young Tibetans from across Tibet, children of farmers and herders, to some of the leading conservationists alive in Tibet today. And that brings us to the key points I want to share with you. It's a challenging place to work inside Tibet, and what we've been able to do before is to help build a global platform for amazing conservation change makers inside Tibet. And one person I will feature today is somebody I admire so deeply, Kuncha Bazan. He was born in a pastoral community high in the plateau, and his parents, his grandparents, for countless generations had been pastoral herders on this very land. And he was the first in his community to go to college. And he could have sought a different kind of life, made more income, whatnot, but he chose to come back, which I deeply respect, to his community. And he spent months conversing with all the elders, talking about the major challenges the community faces and how the community themselves can address those changes. And the key issue they identified was grassland desertification. And I don't have time today, but the community themselves, this is the main message, they themselves figured out a 3-year plan, a 3-year project to take about 50 acres of desert, land that had become desert in the last few decades, and to change it back into grass. So here's an example. I think this was taken, photo was taken in 2012. Their work has expanded much further now, but this is the kind of grassland, desertification they were facing. As you can see, the sand. And just a few months later, they were able to plant this much grass. In the 3-year step process, I observed another section where the grass was up to my shoulders, and I'm about 5'4". So I never thought in my life that I would be brought to tears by looking at grass, but it was such a symbol of rejuvenation and hope, and also such a validation and valuation of local community and kind of their desire to see the land improve and their incredible capacity to find solutions. So a very positive, solutions-oriented story. And the next step, of course, is that Bazan and many of the members in his community who led this work are now trainers, training other Tibetan people, Chinese people, Mongolian people. It's amazing. And there have been now television shows and films, etc., made about these people. But we feel so privileged to have begun working with them at a very early stage. And they're doing the hard work, and our role is to try to share the story. And I'm grateful you're all here to hear what they're doing. It's hard to find these stories without these kinds of forums to share them. So the next person I would like to introduce to you is somebody also who has my utter respect. His name is Dashi Sangbo, and as you can see, he is a monk. And he is also amazingly a citizen scientist. And what he has done, he is also born into a pastoral community. So all his parents and their many countless generations have been working on this land. And he was just born with this intense desire to observe, understand, and protect the local birds. He is a self-taught, brilliant artist. I think he rivals some of the best wildlife artists. And he, over time, has documented through his art well over 300 species on the Tibetan Plateau. But the protection of birds led him to realize that he has to care about the entire ecosystem. So he, as a monk, sought out training in accounting and science and photography and film, all the different skills needed. And then he reached out to fellow pastoralists in his community. And they now there are well over 100 people trained to measure glacial melt, to measure the depth of swamps, to do a bird count, mammal count, so on and so forth. And they have been doing this since the late 1990s and have this tremendous model of how local citizens can care about and be effectively knowledgeable about and protect their own local resources. And yeah, what I'm deeply grateful for with both of these people, here's an example of some of his artwork. What I'm really deeply grateful for with both Kuncho Basang and Dashi Sangbo is that they have gone above and beyond the call of duty in their work and created education programs for the next generation. And They are both men, of course, but they are deeply committed to gender equity. I have known these folks for many years, and in their commitment to the next generation, they ensure there's equal representation of girls and boys in these summer and winter conservation camps, and it's deeply moving. It's something very new on the Tibetan Plateau. So I wanted to also share with you that we, on an ongoing basis, have a Majik Gender Summit. This is an event primarily for Tibetan women to actually convene and talk about some of the most difficult issues that we face as women and people who identify as women in the Tibetan world. It's a bilingual event, but we do have other speakers who participate on the final day. If you're interested, please let me know. You are most welcome to join. And another way that we are trying very hard to link conservation inside Tibet with gender empowerment is through our major annual event, to which you're all invited, of course. It's called Majik Fest. It is a Tibetan Global Ideas Festival. We pour a lot of time and energy into convening incredible speakers and change makers from inside Tibet, many of whom have been conservationists. We have created this event to be incredibly welcoming to young Tibetan women, especially. It's open to everybody, Tibetan, Chinese, global, but we're so proud that many young Tibetan women feel that they have a place and a voice in this kind of event. So we are trying very hard in a difficult context to slowly bring together these worlds for which it means so much to us, our traditional Tibetan values, the indigenous ideas we have around conservation, gender empowerment, and then also doing this in a very complex contemporary context. So one of the key ideas that we have was articulated really clearly by my sister, Majik's co-founder, Dr. Dashi Rabge. She authored the Charter for Engagement for the Future of Tibet in 2008. And this line, when the work sometimes becomes difficult, as social and environmental work does become, or at time to time, this one excerpt has kept me going so many times. The change we seek requires a new political and moral imagination, one that trusts in humanity's potential to embrace a politics of love over a politics of fear. So thank you so much. If you would like to learn more about the ways that we are trying to push this work forward, please feel free to contact me, and I will look forward to speaking with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sang, and such a beautiful talk you shared with us, and we're happy to have you here. So our next speaker hasn't arrived yet, but I'll introduce her quickly, and when she shows up, we can let her speak. So I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker, Anita Sonia, or another speaker, a 22-year-old Kenyan environmental advocate and eco-digital influencer from the Maasai tribe in Kenya. Her passion for the environment led her to establish Spice Warriors at the age of 18, advocating for a safe environment. She is a 2021 TEDx speaker, author of The Green War, and a candidate in Kenya's parliamentary elections later this year. Anita fully intends to push the climate agenda in the corridors of power. And today she'll be sharing her community's experience with climate change, the roles of women in conservation from pastoralist communities, and challenges they face and how they can be solved. So we'll move on to the next slide for now. And I'll introduce to you Fuluke. So I'm pleased to introduce to you our next presenter, Fuluke Adamokon, a gender practitioner who currently serves as executive coordinator of Ajoke Ayisat Afolabi Foundation, Lagos State Coordinator of Women in Mining Nigeria, and the national president of the Association of Nigerian Women in Business. She is passionate about improving livelihoods for grassroots women, and today she'll be sharing about her work to support women-owned and managed businesses. And now over to you, Fuluke. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Ali, and thank you. A good afternoon from Lagos, Nigeria, to all participants here today. I'm just so excited to be, on this platform, and I thank the SGP, for the opportunity. Today we'll be talking about Iru. For those of us who talk about culture, sometimes we look at it from the perspective of language, but food also has a very important role to play in culture. The locust bean seed is widely known, across West Africa. It's used as seasoning or condiments in Nigeria, Senegal, some of the West African countries, and we also have it, in North Africa. It's even gone beyond the shores of Africa to North America, to South America, Asia, and North Africa, also. The locust bean seed, when you hear the name locust bean, you may be tempted to think of it as in terms of the insect, but no, it's just because of the shape. That's why they call it locust bean. And from what we have seen in Nigeria, you have the poorest of the poor women who are involved in the fermenting and processing of locust bean. It's widely used for soup in Nigeria and in other parts. The concern is that it's, that aspect of our culture is being eroded by climate change, by what is happening. Mostly now when you come to Nigeria, for instance, you see lots of construction going on, and this also affects farmland. We also have clashes between herdsmen and farmers that are affecting women farmers. I'm just setting this background so that we can appreciate the seriousness that should be attached to the damage that is being done to our culture and our diet as Africans. For some of us who have been in the university or who have shared rooms with an Africa, particularly those who come from Nigeria, because in Nigeria we take food seriously, our local foods wherever we go. We've read in the newspaper sometimes where people are concerned about the aroma of Nigerian food that is too strong. We've read about non-Africans who want to switch room because of the aroma of their roommate food. But it's part of our culture, and we should be concerned about how climate change is affecting all of this. I want us to move to the next slide, please. Please, can we move on? Yes, from studies that we have seen, we know that women in Nigeria, women are more employed through self-employment. Self-employment platforms provide job opportunities for women. So you can understand when women will be in trade or in services, so they can eke out livings for themselves. And one of the sector that employs women is the food production sector. And the production of Iru in some areas of Nigeria, Iru is called Ogiri. If you go to the southeastern part of Nigeria, the northern part of Nigeria is called Dawa. They have different names, but for the purpose of non-Nigerians or non-Africans, I would just want us to use the African locust bean seed to describe this seed we're talking about today. It's the locust bean seed, apart from its nutritional and health values in homes, it also serves as a source of livelihood for women, for resource poor homes particularly. Like I mentioned earlier, the poorest of the poor are the ones that are engaged in the production, in the fermenting of the locust bean seed, because of the rigors associated with it, and also because of the returns, the financial returns that processors get from this from the process, from producing, from the production of Iru. So when you talk about the unavailability, the lack of access to the seed, it also has complications for food insecurity because of the human effect on the climate. I spoke about how construction, for instance, the building of new houses, modern houses, affect farmland. Some farmlands have been taken over for construction, and because of the clashes between herdsmen and farmers, you see women travel far from their immediate environment to source for seeds that should be fermented into the production of Iru. So there's scarcity in terms of the production, the materials to produce this condiment for seasoning. Food insecurity is one. The deprivation of livelihoods for women who are in this sector, because once you need to travel, once you cannot have access to it, it means your means of income is affected. So there's loss of income for women who are involved in the crushing and the fermenting and in the trading of the seeds itself. If you have followed the trends of clashes from Nigeria, you would have observed that there are reports about sexual and gender-based violence, that women farmers are raped on in their farms, and some are injured, some have been killed. So this also has some implication, for women in terms of safety and security. So it's that's why we are bringing attention to this this issue, to see how we can collectively respond to it, or at least support those who are on the field that are doing some work to provide some response to help women, local women, find some alternative ways of managing the violence that they encounter as women farmers or as women traders who are on the field, involved in the production of food. Next slide, please. Usually, generally in local communities, one way of producing food is the use of fire, and because of the lack of access to a modern way of cooking, wood fuel is one of the approaches that women use for household cooking. And if we have followed what is happening right now, currently, the conflicts across the world, we have seen how gas prices, is the price of gas is rising. This also has some implication for women, for cooking. So what do people do, particularly in Nigeria? They resort, to falling down, trees, using trees, for cooking. And I tell you, as at 2013, in Kaduna State, for instance, 1,722,904 tons of wood fuel is used by year per person in a state in Nigeria. Nigeria has 36 states and minus the federal capital territory. Even beyond that, let's look at all other African countries where wood fuel is the means for cooking and for homes, for events. So we can see the effect of man on the environment, and consequently on households, particularly on women who usually are the bottom rung of the ladder of financial freedom. Next slide. These are some of the women that you see at work. You see even how the soil from the soil, you can see lack of nutrients and how this affects what they do. Some of these women, they don't go to farm in Nigeria because of the fear of herdsmen who invade farms and rape women. So in terms of food production, it's been very, very low. Next slide, please. So looking at the issue critically, we want to consider what are the other impacts of climate change on women, not just on their livelihoods, but in terms of knowledge, in terms of how they share, manage knowledge. These women that are in the trade of the hero production, they are like a database, a repertoire, of knowledge itself. They are familiar with the health benefits, medicinal benefits of this herb, in addition to the nutrient, that we get from it. But the way it is that this, this is going into extinction. There has been no effort, to document the knowledge that these women, they have on the management of the hero itself, how it is used for medicine and for food. So the part of the effort that we are doing now is to see how to document, the knowledge that indigenous women, have on Iru, because it's important we are able to pass this message on, to other, to the younger generation. It is also important that we are able to preserve this knowledge for the purpose of generating new ideas, or finding alternative source to the Iru itself, like they are doing. There are efforts that are ongoing in the field that we also need to take a critical look and see how we can have some improvement or share some new knowledge about other sector with the women. We have I know that there are concerns about the health implication of seasoning, and these are things that we could have share this information, this knowledge. We could share with these women, and also gather some information from them that could be fed into whatever production that is that corporations or people outside of their environment are engaged in. Some of the knowledge that we have gathered on the field is that, in addition to the health benefits of Iru, that it can also act as a repellent. So if from the knowledge, based on the knowledge that women who operate in this sector, they are very poor because of the nature of the product itself. Not many people that are not Africans would like to use the material, the product as it is now. But there are some other benefits that we can gather from it. For instance, if it's useful for if it is useful as a thickener, like we have read some, we need to do the research and make sure that the women are supported to create more innovative ideas, or suggest some more innovative ways of making use of the product in itself. Next, please. So in our own way, we are suggesting that there are other things that can be done going forward. The suggestion here is to see how, as a team or as a group or as participants, we can work together to develop strategies. To work together with state actors, to develop strategies in addressing the issue of violence, gender-based violence that are targeting women farmers, and targeting processors of the locust bean seed, those who ferment and those who trade on it, based on the impact of violence on farms and on women farmers. We are also, like I mentioned earlier, when we talk about the issue of documentation, it's also important that efforts are made to document and preserve local food knowledge. We need to make that effort to preserve local food knowledge. because the food is not just herbs are not just for food, they are for medicine. They are also part of our culture. They said food is a means of identifying various cultures. And it's important that we preserve knowledge to preserve these cultures. Otherwise, at some point, they may go out of extinction. And now is the time. I don't think we should wait until later when this is destroyed 100% before we begin to try to respond or to react, because at that point it would be a reaction. It's also important that we support women farmers to engage in the process for replacing trees that have been used as wood fuel, trees that were brought down because of construction. I know locally we are trying to do some of these things, but working together with a cross-section of people will help to intensify whatever efforts and contribution, or to enhance the efforts that are being made by local women themselves in this sector. Next, please.
Just one moment. I'm sorry to interrupt, Fuluke, just to say that Anita Soina has been able to join the call, and we need to wrap up. So if we can move along in 1 to 2 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we are at the point where we are trying to create very valuable partnership. And one of the opportunities that this platform has provided is to raise awareness on the issue of climate change and food insecurity, and as well as gender-based violence, particularly against women farmers, against women who are in a specific sector of the food production value chain, not just only in Nigeria, but across Africa and across communities where you have vulnerable women. So lastly, I urge all of us to work together to see how we can create a system of knowledge, a body of knowledge on indigenous livelihoods, their practices, and the rehabilitative efforts that women are making to sustain their livelihoods. Because right now, women in Nigeria, they are looking at the option of soybean, but no one has made any effort to see if this is relevant or if this will be as valuable as the local bean seed has been. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fuluke, for sharing with us. We're really happy to hear what you have to say. So Anita has actually joined the room, and so I introduced her already. We're happy to have you here, Anita. If we can go back to her slides so we can see her bio again. But then whenever you're ready, Anita, you can go ahead and talk. We're happy to have you here.
Okay, thank you so much. And I want to first of all apologize, but at least I made it. I'm so sorry.
Okay,
Here in Kenya, it's political season, and running for office, you just have to jump into meetings after meetings. First of all, I'd like to appreciate the role that SGP is playing in supporting such initiatives and such forums. I am so grateful. So maybe what I'm going to highlight in my presentation is more of how my community is supporting conservation and how women in my community are also suffering consequences of climate crisis, and how they're also trying to contribute to climate action. First of all, my name is Anita Soina once again. I am a Kenyan environmental activist. I started environmental activism at the age of 18 in 2018. And I've been working with a group of young people trying to just educate and trying to pass a message across that you don't have to have studied any related course for you to fight, or maybe for you to be environmentally conscious. I'm also an author of a book called The Green War. It highlights environmental challenges in Kenya, Africa, and the world. And one of the key chapters is one called climate anxiety, a topic that is often ignored, but also something that many people are going through in the activism and in the advocacy movement. I come from the Maasai community. Maasai community is the famous tribe in Kenya that sells Kenya. When it comes to culture, the culture of the Maasai people, they have been able to preserve their culture for a long time. And also going down to their communal land that hosts most of the national parks, reserves, conservancies, where we have a lot of wild animals in Kenya. So for a very long time, the Maasai people have been coexisting with wildlife peacefully. I can give an example of a sanctuary, one of the first elephant sanctuary to have women employed, like 99% of their staff being women. Is called Reteti Elephant Sanctuary, found in the northern parts of Kenya. That is Samburu. And this is a sanctuary that rescues elephants from different conservancies and parks. And usually the people who rescue these elephants are usually the people who live around there, the women, the men, I mean, just everybody who lives around the conservancy. So they have played a very big role in making sure that they do rescue these elephants and other animals as well. So that is one of the biggest roles that they play. But when you look at all that, climate change has affected people more. For the case where maybe to say poverty levels gets worsened by climate change every other time. And my community, being a pastoralist community, face the same. When we have when we say we have too much drought, it means our cattle are not going to have enough pasture and water and all that. And now surviving becomes even a problem. So people end up even marrying off their young daughters in exchange of wealth for them to survive and all those things. So still in this, as much as these challenges affect us as a community, I can say affect women more. Women in their families are the ones who are known to be providing food for the families. And right now, most families are food insecure. So you can imagine what happens when you are a mom, you are a daughter, and you need to go and look for food, and food is a challenge and all those things. And maybe also to say that when it comes to climate financing, a lot of women-led initiatives are not really on the forefront. So you find that we are the ones suffering these consequences the more. We are the ones who are also trying to help when it comes to action. So the least we are asking for is that when these resources are being distributed, we are not saying that we need much, but at least can we start from 50-50, so that when we have climate financing, we also finance women-led initiatives equally as we do to men-led initiatives. I think another thing on the challenge that we as a community now, that is general, is that when it comes to conservation, the action part of it, it's the people from the community. But when it comes to the people who make a living or earn a living from conservation, becomes people from outside the community areas, which sometimes discourages people, the communities, from engaging in conservation. Because if they are seeing people, when you let people understand how they can also earn a living from conservation, then that motivates them to be more conscious. That keeps them going. But when it happens that they are the ones who are doing much, but when it comes to benefiting, it's people from outside, then that becomes a challenge, and that makes other people don't see the need of being in environment conservation. And I think maybe finally, because of time, I also wanted to touch on politics and climate change. Many a times we have this notion that, I don't know if it's there in your countries, there's this thing about when you join politics, you cannot work with certain NGOs or organizations in conservation because they tend to associate politics to be that, I don't know, like something dirty that can't be associated with organizations. And it becomes a challenge, especially for us who are trying to change. You know, when we talk about action, climate action or any type of action, it's very broad. We could have activists, we could have so and so, we will have private sector and all those things. But when it comes to government, who do we have inside there who understand these challenges? Who do we have that anytime we are going to present a petition, or we are going on a strike, or we are going begging, demanding, crying, and asking them to work on something that is affecting the people? Who inside that government understands these challenges? So I think when we should just encourage and maybe let young or whoever person who wants to go for power from the environmental sector to just go for it, because the first step towards solving this problem is showing up and presenting ourselves that, you know what, we have been striking every day, we have been sending petitions, we have been trying this, but it's not working. Why don't we go and sit in those spaces so we can be doing it? I call it influencing change from the corridors of power. So it is something that is a challenge. And the nature of politics in Africa, and let me say Kenya to be specific, does not favor youths and does not favor women. Now, you can imagine being both. It can be being a youthful woman is now another problem. And then now being in conservation, trying to sell an agenda that many people don't see its importance. I have sat down with many people and told them how we can push the climate agenda from the political side. And they will always say that, you know, those things are just, those things are not real. I mean, you know, they can even wait. Can we just discuss about how we can get people water? Come on. I mean, we don't have water because of these climate crisis whole thing. So you can't run away from environment. And I like to remind them that as much as you have beautiful manifestos with beautiful economic models, environment is at the center of it all. So if you can't allow us to go for this, then there's nothing that you're going to do. So I think we should make that clear. We should try and push the conversation and make it clear to people that politics and environment conservation, politics and climate change go hand in hand. The policies that we have today, sometimes you're told you can't do anything because of the policies. So who are these people, the policy makers? So I think that is something we need to make clear. Let's not, so that we don't have organizations like here, sometimes you want to do something even political, because, you know, as long as you're in politics, you just have to put yourself in that political setup. But you will hear that a certain organization said they want to work with you because you join politics. And I'm like, wow, I'm going to fight climate change in there. You're fighting from outside. I mean, we are all doing the same thing. I think that's all for today because of time.
Thank you so much, Anita. I'm really happy you're able to show up, and we're really happy to have you here. It's an amazing presentation you had there. So we'll move on to our next speaker before our breakout rooms, who is Lisa Perch, founder of Sadie Consulting. I'll see if we can get the slides. Here we go. So Lisa is joining us from Barbados, and her motivation for establishing Sadie was her commitment to bridging and eliminating the programming and financial gaps that hold back progress on social and environmental policies. Her expertise draws from 20 years experience in international development, including climate change, poverty reduction, sustainable livelihoods, inclusive green growth, and gender policy. Lisa will be sharing about expanding the space for Indigenous feminist engagement and organizing in the Caribbean and beyond. And now over to you, Lisa. I'll go to the next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Ali. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here this afternoon. I was just about to say morning. And great to be sharing this space with SGP. I've been a member for many years, and it's wonderful to partner with SGP and also to see all the faces here. Obviously, I'm following behind three amazing speakers who have really kind of explored and highlighted a number of issues in terms of centering Indigenous feminist voices and thinking and knowledge in the context of climate change, in terms of policy, even in terms of how we perhaps are defining the issue, as Anita has highlighted, and the ways in which we still sometimes miss and are not connecting the dots. So as she rather eloquently said, we are seeing some of the impacts of climate, but we're not connecting them to some of the practices. We're not connecting them to our politics. As Feluke said, we're not connecting them to things that we take for granted and are part of our identity, part of our food security, even part of ways in which we're innovating. I never really knew about locust bean, but I went online and saw that it actually also is a thickener for gluten-free based products. It has a lot of wonderful kind of applications. And so there's all this knowledge out there. And then you also have the wonderful story by Losang in terms of, intergenerational knowledge, practice in terms of conservation. And again, you see the amazing impact that can have, even sometimes not necessarily in the absence of money, but in the absence of a lot of money. And so I think this is a good opportunity for me now to think about how we, all of us collectively, particularly some of the work that we're doing at Society Consulting, but also even in the context of SGP, can really leverage this and change the narrative a bit, and also ensure that we're not losing any of these angles of indigenism, I would say, the understanding of climate and its impacts, and also the ways in which we actually ensure that we include Indigenous voices and feminist voices, and perhaps not in narrow ways in which we normally do. So next slide, please. So, I start off with a quote from an Indigenous feminist voice from Honduras, from the region. I'm from Latin America and the Caribbean, and, centered in the idea that in her fight, she's fighting for future generations. Can we go back? Thank you. So that they will have the resources and the assets they need to survive on a planet that's being destroyed every day. I think this is an important quote because in many ways it is a fight, even though we talk about gender-based violence, but the nature of the issues is such, the context and the challenges are so significant that in some ways we are fighting. And we have to be battle ready. I think that's also what Anita was saying, that we cannot ignore the politics. Politics is there, and we need to be ready to take on the issues. And as we talk about resources, often we think about finance, but we need more than that. We need these stories, we need the knowledge, we need the histories, we need the understanding of some of these simple things, as simple and as small as a seed, that may actually be critical to food security. So while we may be doing a lot of other things, investing in technologies, inputs, and other things, sometimes the answers are right there in front of us and are provided by nature for free. And so I think that's one of the things that Indigenous Voices helps remind us, that money is not everything. It's important, but it's not everything. And there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of solutions out there that are sitting right in front of us that we're not taking advantage of. I loved Losang's story because what also it said is that persons can come from different areas and contribute to an issue that they were not trained in. And that's very much me. I started out as a social scientist who got into environment. That was not an easy transition to make. And this is probably why I do a lot of work that is very much about bringing social science and environmental science together, because I do think that if we're going to do environmental science and we're going to talk about changing behaviors, then there's no other area that knows that as well or has done as much as social science. Environmental science has not been known for understanding people. It's been known for understanding nature and scientific issues. And so if we want to really address these issues and we want to change the narrative, then we do need to bring these issues together. And I think what we're saying is that in the context of the global climate change movement, but also within our local and national stories, it's about bringing all these voices together and respecting what they can bring to the story. Next slide, please. And we know that defenders and human rights defenders are on the front lines and literally sometimes dying for the right to speak and the right to represent us on the issues. We know that in many cases, they are fighting for some of the most basic of resources, including land, and land that often has been given to them or for which they've been given rights. We know that they're impacted by climate issues, and they have been on the forefront of the justice movement, often straddling and actually dragging and integrating older issues from way back in the day to the more present day and modern issues, and making those connections in ways that we often have missed and have not seen. And so we also owe them a debt in that context as well. Next slide, please. If we look at Colombia, for example, there we also see how these issues intersect, not just in the context of gender-based violence, but conflict. And we see increasingly, there's a growing nexus between gender, climate, conflict, and displacement. And displacement, not just in the physical terms, in terms of climate refugees, which are important, but also the fact that we're talking about social displacement, where people are losing their culture or losing access to cultural assets. That is a form of displacement. It has a cost. When we're also thinking about economic displacement, even though we mean to do well in the context of adaptation, shifting someone from one practice or one form of livelihood to another does not come without a cost. We hope the benefit on the other end will be larger, but if we don't think about the fact that there's a cost in that transition, and we don't make sure that that benefit is more significant, it's quite likely that maybe it will be a wash, or it could even be less than they were gaining before. And if we look at the context of Colombia, there are some lessons we can learn there in terms of the combination of war and violence in very intense and very important critical biodiversity hotspots. So this tension and the value that we have for resources is not accidental in terms of how some of the contextual issues of conflict, war, and violence occur. The recognition for the value of the resources is there. The way that they're negotiated and managed, often sometimes it seems in a very indirect way, but there is an understanding of the value of these resources. Those who protect and defend the environment are often perceived as radicals, immersed in dogma and irrational. Mind you, the ones who are fighting are also very clear that these things have value and that the fight is worth it. So who really is irrational? Women's involvement, often voluntary, and not necessarily always focused on improving livelihoods, but understanding and ensuring that before we make a leap, we do so with a full understanding of what will be required and what it will cost, are also are also key for ensuring that we bring together and add the value of that knowledge. Women's unpaid labor, sometimes very indiscreetly, unseen and invisible, and also making sure that some of these resources are still available, even in small doses, and also the cycle of poverty. We also see barriers to attending environmental events, and we've seen, and we'll talk a little bit about that a little later on in the context of COP26, when we looked at who was there, we looked at who was represented, we looked at who was speaking. And while we could commiserate and we could understand what they were speaking, there was also a sense on my part at least, and I think the parts of others, of coming to that with a really fundamental and true understanding of living on the front lines of the issue. It's one thing to intellectually understand something, it's another thing to be living the reality. And I think that's another reason where we want to make sure that we're not only talking about the issues now, but also the experience, understanding how we do not return to issues of violence, because one of the things that will happen with climate is resources will get less, the quality will decline, the number will decline, and there will be more conflict and tensions around resources. Next slide, please. When we look at that COP26 experience, we see many concerns about a continuation of a colonialistic approach to managing the environment that is anti-Indigenous in some ways, even if not purposely so, or certainly non-inclusive. But we also recognize that it's part of a continuing challenge we've often had with the environment and environmental management, where often we have perhaps instinctively blamed the poor and blame those who have been advocating and been pushing against the agenda for some of the impacts. Meanwhile, the fact is that the science tells us they have contributed very little to the problem. We also recognize that, even where there was no purposeful exclusion still occurred. And so persons struggled to be able to get there, to be able to get into forums. In some cases, you had groups trying to cover a broad range of forums with 2 people. All of these are measures and mechanisms that we need to look at seriously if we're going to really change and shift the narrative, the way in which we include voices, and the way we do so to make sure that they're able to participate at the same level and to do so meaningfully. And if we are going to look for a different kind of perspective in COP27, it will be important for us to learn lessons from COP26 and beyond. Next slide, please. This exclusion from decision-making, was visible, it was written about, it was noted, and it also became clear in pictures. So this is one picture, but there was always the famous one as well of all the leaders. And we all had to lean forward, at least I did, to count the number of women. And I think we all couldn't be sure whether there were 4 or 6, but I think it was 6 was the maximum that I found. And in 2022, in the context of all that we've seen and learned, particularly from COVID-19, it was stunning that there would only be 6 leaders who were women at such an event, and at such a time when climate change is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening on top of a number of issues and on top of a COVID pandemic, which showed that risk was no longer just extensive or intensive, but both, and actually had also become every day. And so our framing, our thinking needed to change. Next slide, please. And I'm sure that if you look back in the past, this may not be the first time that we're dealing with this, but again, because we're not allowing for that traditional knowledge, that historical learned knowledge to be at the table, we may be missing some of the lessons and solutions that also worked in the past that may be applicable now. There is a cost to this discrimination and exclusion, and it's not just some of the things that I've mentioned. When we look at it, we also look at the cost in terms of pledges to Indigenous communities, but the funding is first going to states before going to the communities themselves. Maybe it trickles down, but that trickle down does not have the kind of impact that we need. And this issue of how we do our financing, how we make it more gender responsive, how we make it more climate relevant, also needs to include how we make it more Indigenous accessible, I would think, if we're really going to get the work that we need done. World leaders have promised time and time again about reversing many things, including deforestation. It's now 2022. We have 8 years to 2030, and 30 by 30 is an ambitious plan, but it fails to take into account realities of Indigenous subsistence lifeways, pathways, and raises fears that perhaps traditional practices, which are not always culture, but in some cases can be, will be prohibited or eliminated in the face of other demands, and without, again, understanding the cost that may have. They may be traditional, but they actually might be more protective of the environment in some cases than some of the solutions that we might be putting on the table. At least we have to ask ourselves the question if that is the case. Next slide, please. For us at Saidi Consulting, and in terms of our ongoing collaboration with SGP and others, what we're hoping to do is, outside of this event, is to continue to raise the profile of Indigenous voices and to have also a very specific event this year that will look at Indigenous women and issues of Indigenous justice. We have a series of webinars that we do every year. Last year, we were very general, looking at issues of women, natural resources, and environment. This year, we want to focus a bit more on the topic and focus in on some of the specific needs, contexts, and issues that are being faced by specific groups. And for us, given the issues that we're seeing on the table, Indigenous feminist voices are going to be key in that review, discussion, and ongoing conversation. And we will definitely want to make sure that we invite as many of you as we can, and that we also have and continue these conversations. So we're also hoping to open up a space where, when we have these topics that we enjoy, we think perhaps benefit from conversation as well as research, and that we can look at some collective collaborations and efforts that we can continue to do so. And so I really look forward to hearing some of the comments and feedback from you in terms of the 4 presentations that we've had today, and also how we can actually do better and make COP27 and other forums and events a significant difference. This year is also, I think, a UNCCD conference agenda is there, and they have an actual gender agenda that they're looking at. So there are many opportunities that we can take advantage of to leverage and highlight this issue as an important one going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for your presentation. So we're going to move into the breakout rooms now. We're running a bit short on time, so we're just going to do one breakout room. Sorry, somebody's mic is on. I'm not sure. If everyone could just check. Thank you. So we'll call for the breakout room for about 30 minutes, I think. And here's the slide on how to use Zoom, so I'll skip to that first. In order to join the breakout rooms, there's a button at the bottom of the page that says breakout rooms. And so if you click that, you'll be able to see which room you can join. And then I'll move to the slide before this, so I can, sorry, the slide below this. Sorry about that. In the breakout rooms, you'll be able to use this space to share your questions, experience, expertise, and ideas. We have some suggested topics that are shown on this slide. And so you can choose whichever room you want to join based on the questions and based on the speakers. So just note that the breakout room sessions are not going to be recorded, and there will only be anonymized notes that are made. So feel free to share whatever you want, or don't share if you don't have anything to say, but we're happy to have you there to discuss. So after the breakout session, we'll come back together and we'll share some of the highlights from the breakout rooms. And I also want to note that we have a resource page that we'll share out. So in the breakout rooms, if you want to share some resources you have related to the topics, we can add it to the document and send it out to everybody after. So I think we can start the breakout rooms now, if that's okay. If I missed anything, just feel free to jump in. But I think if it's unclear, just let us know in the chat as well. We'll be there to help you.
Wonderful. At this point in time, you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen a breakout room tab, and then you can choose to join whichever room you want. There's room 1, 2, and 3.
Yes.
All right, so now we're recording. I hope everybody had a really good time in the breakout rooms. We had really good discussions in ours, so I hope everybody had some good discussions going on. So I was hoping, we don't have that much time, but maybe we could take a few minutes to report back. If we have enough time, we're running a bit short. What do you think?
We can take a minute for some highlights.
All right.
Yeah. Losang or anybody from room 1, Anushka, does anybody want to jump in with a couple of reflections? Or I can do that as well if you like. Okay, all right. So, oh my gosh, sorry, one moment. I meant to mute my phone. Yeah, so we had a discussion about the importance of education and girls' education fundamentally to really engage in sort of climate action and movements towards climate justice. There's so much that needs to come first, but also that, you know, there's a lot of indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge that, you know, unfortunately is under attack, or some of it's being lost. But there are a lot of indigenous rights movements that are focusing on bringing that back, or preserving indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge and indigenous languages, which help convey some of that information, and have done so for centuries, for generations. At the same time, we have to be aware of the tensions, and this is something that's referred to as two-eyed seeing in some indigenous communities in North America, but the idea of combining both all of that traditional knowledge and indigenous ways of being with modern scientific processes and knowledge and rights-based approaches. So that thank you very much, Ali Constantine. You have shared the term in one of the indigenous languages in North America, in Turtle Island. But yeah, it's important that we don't just sort of reify tradition and culture and religion as ways that, you know, something to go back to as a halcyon time, because there are a lot of tensions and times change, and certain more progressive practices may be lost and need rediscovering. And so we need to evaluate judiciously and not sort of go on sort of high level labels. And do we want to, if anybody else wants to jump in for room 1, or we can also move into room 2's highlights.
Yeah, I think we also talked about how change should be community driven, which is what Dr. Losang was talking about, which was very important, and how we balance and share the decision-making powers between Indigenous people and, you know, and people who would be in those decision-making roles. So I just wanted to add that point as well to everything that Sarah said.
Does somebody from room 2?
Shiloh, please. Shiloh is going to make the report.
Yes, okay, sorry. So for the first question, I'll just go quickly. For the first question, which was relating to how we can respond to land insecurity and clashes over land rights and food insecurity, we talked about food sovereignty and how it relates to land rights. One resolve is helping women with land ownership, and how there are many variables that prohibit impact land ownership. We talked about how land is extremely important to economic empowerment as well as political participation. And we also talked about the consequences of conflict, how that creates social changes, such as how women became heads of households, only to have the title transferred to their sons when they became of age. We talked about adopting instruments of law, designating certain areas to agricultural practice, and the implementation of law, and especially involving women in the formulation and implementation of this legislation. And we also talked about seeking collective or community ownership of land and how what a role that can play. For the second question, we talked about how can traditional ecological knowledge led by Indigenous people be incorporated into the decision-making process. Sorry, that was the question. But we talked about how to integrate different perspectives. We communicated some sort of reverse advisory group where local people who work in the industry with a generational history in the area and how to organize those individuals who can advise local governments based on their lived experiences or somehow make them part of a community or advisory board. We talked about the importance of preserving local traditions. We also talked about the engagement between local communities and government and other stakeholders, how it's important to capture the voices of Indigenous communities. We also talked about demonstrating other uses to find a common ground. The example, of course, being locust beans and how some Europeans and Americans are repulsed by the scent, but how perhaps by finding different uses for it, there can still be a common ground made. And we also talked about the importance of noting that when developing something new, not everything Indigenous is bad, and that there are even cases where foreign companies come in, demand a certain crop be planted, only to have the non-Indigenous plant be killed by plague, ruining the yield. And lastly, we just wanted to emphasize engaging and to do more engagement. And if Luke or anyone else has anything else to add.
Yeah, thank you, Shiloh. I think you captured the essence of our discussions. Thank you.
And from room 3, do we have someone to share out some highlights?
Yes, sure, Sarah. So in group 3, we were discussing how we can use the law or the court can be used as a tool or space for constructing, producing, and defending rights. And we were able to come up with, it was a very engaging conversation, and people are really talking about the effects of colonialism and how we need to hold these systems accountable and ensure that these mechanisms are actually addressed, and also that we need to keep reminding the effects and also the court processes to adhere to what they promise. And also, especially like in African countries, we have the customary law being respected more than the constitutional law. And so there is no any important position for women in law. And therefore, women are not protected by the law, and the land also are not protected. And also another issue came up on need for legal aid and legal assistance for women, even when they're seeking these rights for themselves. And also, our number 2 question was also, how do we construct, and do we even need to construct land as a right? And a need for civic education was identified. Women in most parts are always powerless because of lack of education. And some of our women also lack literacy skills, and therefore they don't benefit equally to these laws because they don't even understand that they actually have these rights. And also, there was also a need to ensure that women actually benefit equally to the land proceeds, and even when they work on the farms and the lands. And therefore, there's a need for understanding for these rights. Also, people had different opinions on whether we should assign a right to land. And some of us actually thought that it can be dangerous to assign rights to land because sometimes this can be dangerous. Therefore, we need to identify who has these rights and how are these rights being implemented. And also was pointed out that when we have rights, they come with responsibility by duty bearers, and also some of the effects that this has had in different spaces, we've had that there are some legal battles between tribes because of certain rights. Also, there has been protest, water battles in Mexico, and also the issue of access and control of land. So that we find that those who are assigned land, they can be assigned the land, but then they lack control of the resources that are on the land. So there is a need to look at this issue comprehensively and ensure that those people who have the rights are actually implement it well, and therefore there is a sufficient approach and comprehensive approach to land rights. And also there is also a need to value the contributions of women and their inputs, and efforts of women need to be recognized.
Thank you, Jacinta. Yeah, in the interest of time, I think we'll need to wrap up. So if we can just show the last slide. Thank you. So thank you everybody for being here, especially the wonderful panelists and all the participants. We'll be sending everybody who registered the notes and the slides from today's session and the resources list. If you have any questions or delayed reactions that you want to share, you can always reach out by email at info@genderprofessionals.org. You can join Gender Professionals at the website if you'd like, or learn more about us. Note that the annual membership fees, the dues are suggested as an amount, and it's entirely flexible, but if there's any barriers to registering, you can write to us at info@genderprofessionals and let us know. And we're also happy to take proposals for future gender cafes through our website. And we hope that we will see you at an SGP event again soon. Thank you very much, everyone.
And one more quick note, I will share the resource document that everybody submitted to. I'll collect all the information and I'll send that out to everybody on the registration. Thank you, everybody, so much for being here.
You all.
Thank you. Take care.